The Return, Chapter 3, Death in the Desert. The trip had been a huge waste of their time, beginning with a 12-hour flight. Johnson made no comment as Saameron, with trembling hands, crushed and inhaled a soother to ease the pain in his ears, silently passed Saam extra air sickness bags and watched him throw up 4 times, helped him to some bottled water, watched out of the corner of his eye as he fitted the special earphones that the Nadiv supplied them with, listened patiently as he grumbled about the airplane, the noise it made, the way it trembled. Was he sure it would fly? And then calmed a little, and finally curled up and fell asleep, and snored softly, or possibly purred. He hoped the retrieval would go smoothly. Saam needed a rest. When they landed, Johnson's local contact did not turn up as promised. Saameron waited quietly, sat where they parked him, and listened for the better part of 2 hours, while some minor officials berated Johnson, loudly challenging his authority to bring livestock, Saameron, into the country. He understood some of what was said, but kept his face peaceful and still, even when 2 men with automatic rifles on their shoulders came to take a closer look. He kept his eyes down when they whispered about how beautiful his mouth was, hardly the first time he'd heard the comment. He sank a little into himself when they prodded him to his feet, surprised and irritated that he was a little taller than them. The movie, The Vengeance, that had made his face familiar almost everywhere on this planet, was banned in their country, but many of them, these men included, had seen it. They wanted him to take off the T-shirt and show them the tattoo, the white tattoo along his spine, Vengeance, written in Nadiv. He understood quickly, but allowed them to shout a little, prod him a few more times, before opening his mouth in feigned surprise, nodding, "Oh, okay." He obliged, pulled the T-shirt over his head, and turned his back to them. They hesitated before touching it with their fingertips, cautiously rather than gently, as if aware that they were doing something they really should not. One of them shoved him again, turned him around so that they could check him out from the front. Saam kept his eyes down until one of them pushed him hard enough in the chest to make him take a step backwards. He looked up, made soft eye contact with the man, and knew he was in trouble. The angry, outraged lust in the man's eyes was familiar. The Karagath guards back on Hanath sometimes looked at him that way. They could look, but touching him would cost them a flogging. So they looked and simmered. There were humans who looked at him that way too. More than one had explained to him how repulsive he was, how tainted, sickening and obscene. But somehow that didn't stop them wanting to touch him. Hence the affront, the deeply felt anger towards him. He would not need his knife to kill the man. Taking the weapon away and breaking his neck would scarcely be a challenge, but he considered the consequences. Likely both he and Johnson would end up dead, and the E.T. they came to retrieve would never be found. Saam breathed deeply and slowly, calming himself, soothed himself with the thought that if he must submit to a sweaty, fumbling rape, at least he was no longer on that fucking plane. At least there was breakfast to look forward to. The man had one hand on his bare chest, staring into Saam's quiet eyes, curling his lip as he saw that Saam would not resist. When the local contact finally showed up, he hissed disgust and disapproval at the 2 security men who evaporated like mist. He looked uncertainly at Saameron, waved his hands irritably to encourage him to dress, hesitated long enough to see the famous tattoo for himself, then turned back to Johnson. There was no breakfast, only bottled water for both of them. Only 3 more hours of travelling, sometimes in the jeep when they were in open desert, sometimes in the filthy back section of a covered truck. first in freezing cold, later in blazing heat, watching the sand dunes go by, the wrecked cars and skeletons of what had once been buildings, refugees carrying enormous packs, clamouring for assistance until their locally supplied hard men shooed them away in their own language. Listening to the automatic gunfire, occasionally the sound of a missile going overhead, landing. More than once the truck had shaken at the impact. The local interpreter, Faisal, refused to speak directly to Saam, so that he had to put any questions through Johnson. The little man had smiled unpleasantly at Saam when he handed over one of those gowns that cover the face, the whole body to the toes. A burqa, was that what it was called? It didn't matter. Saam accepted it wordlessly. It was not his first time passing as a woman. When they finally reached it, the mortuary was gated and guarded, and probably one of the safest places in the city. Faisal ushered them, Johnson, into the blessedly cool building and introduced him to the mortuary head. Bowing and toadying ensued. The man froze when Saam loosened his headdress. His expression was complicated. Was that fear, or something else? He was reluctant to let anyone other than Johnson and the interpreter into the cold room, but Johnson calmly insisted. The locals gave Saam a wide berth as he passed into the room where the corpses were kept. After all this effort, the E.T., the man they were invited to come and retrieve, was already dead. A cherub. Looking down at the body, Saam's hands were trembling very slightly. Johnson whispered, "Do you know him?" But Saam shook his head, a bare twitch. He was lying flat on his stomach, his head turned aside. Dead men often looked stupid, but this one seemed peaceful, as if death had come as a release, like falling asleep. Saam touched the hair momentarily, as if to comfort the man, then pulled down the covering sheet to see the bare back. Bruises everywhere. He checked the collar, shook his head again. Nothing he recognized. He put out a hand and placed it over the spine at the lower back, almost covering the most prominent mark. At some point he'd been held down by the intense pressure of one large hand. Just above his hips on either side was a pair of oval bruises, possibly made by thumbs. Saam made a rolling motion with his hand, and after glancing at Johnson to see if this was his wish, the mortician turned the body. The marks of the 4 fingers that belonged to each thumb stood out clearly on either side. He'd been held face down by 2 hands above his hips. Saam's newly acquired understanding of Russian had been of some small use, in that he was now in a position to understand some of the hateful asides made by the men dealing with the body. Now they could burn it before it started to really stink. The Russian aides were just being practical. The locals were more pointed in their comments. The mortician pointed to the fingerprints. "Probably raped," he said, and shrugged, indifferent. Saam gave no sign that he'd understood the Arabic, since an early experience when one civic-minded zealot had tried to cut his throat when he spoke. In his considered opinion, teaching a blue dog to speak Arabic was haram. The mortician made eye contact, smiled sympathetically at Saam, and said in cloying tones, "Thus may all your kind perish," while the interpreter said rapidly, "He expresses his sorrow for this sad loss." Showing no sign of understanding, Saam had nodded his thanks. There were no identifying marks that he could find, no tattoos. Saam traced his fingertips along his broken jaw, his cracked cheekbones, his hairline, where even his skull creaked and moved a little under the light pressure. There was no sign of any communications equipment under the skin, probably not a fighter. He could pass the photos around, but little more than that. He asked Johnson to be sure to get several good shots of the collar. The mortician watched his face in fascination, like a cat watching a mouse he had bitten hard and allowed to run. His sympathetic tone was unchanged when he said, for the benefit of his amused staff, "This one has a pretty mouth." The interpreter almost choked, then said, "He is now at peace." The covering sheet was pulled to his knees, with the mortician continuing to watch Saam ferally. The dead man had also been castrated. Saam's face didn't change in expression, but he started to sway. Johnson made excuses about the heat and hurried him out before he could faint. He repeated his orders about the pictures and ushered him out to the car park. They could hear the men behind them laughing as they left. Johnson stood by him in the car park as he ripped off the burqa, bent and retched. He left him sitting on the end of the truck, his head between his knees, when he went back to collect the mortuary photos. Their armed guards stood silently, shuffling a little. When Faisal finally showed his face, for one brief moment Saam considered cutting him. Just a little. Unexpectedly, he suddenly spoke directly to Saam. He said quietly and humbly, "I am sorry. It is better you do not know what they said. These people they are not good people. I am sorry." Saam nodded. "You're still sacked," he thought. Another 3 hours in the filthy truck. After a long, silent wait at the airport, the chartered plane arrived to take them home. Safe. Finally they could relax. As long as no one tried to shoot them out of the sky. Once on board, Saam pulled off his T-shirt. "It stinks," he explained, as he fished in the overhead compartment, searching his backpack for a replacement. Johnson nodded. He was looking at the handprints above Saam's hips. Saam desperately needed to eat, but he waited until he had vomited his way through takeoff before he ripped open the sandwiches they had bought in the airport. He ate 3 and looked at the last sandwich half eaten in Johnson's hand. Then he slowed a moment, nodded. Johnson needed to eat too. He groaned a little, rubbed a suffering ear, then fished out a soother. He was scratching in his pouch for his earphones when Johnson said, "The Vengeance wasn't noisy." Saam smiled at him, shook his head. The idea amused him. No, even the engine room was quiet. He didn't feel like explaining to Johnson how he felt about the primitive tech they were flying in. He would have felt safer in a hot air balloon. He plugged his earphones carefully in place, then curled like a cat and fell asleep. A few hours passed before Saam cried out in his sleep and woke them both. Johnson arranged some cold beers for them, while Saam mopped his sweating face. They sipped in companionable silence. Eventually Johnson said, "The Vengeance, the movie. You met the guys who made it while you were in hospital. That's in the file. But how? How did you come to meet them?" Saam smiled. "And physio. They were in a car accident, and the same doctor was treating them. I used to see them when I was exercising. They watched me run. I watched them eat. There was a little cafe just outside the physio center, and they would come in with muffins and coffee, which they didn't always finish. I was on a restricted diet to build muscle mass, and I was always hungry. They didn't speak to me because I was an alien. I didn't speak to them because I had a minder with me all the time. Then one day I went back, told some lie about leaving my water bottle behind. One of them had changed his mind, gone back to pick up his muffin, which I was busy eating." Saam laughed softly. Johnson smiled at him, imagining. Hungry, in a hurry, Saam could put a whole muffin in his mouth at once. He tried to picture the movie mogul's reaction to a hungry Kerep inhaling a muffin. That must have been something to see. They fell silent again for a while. Then, "You know," he said, "you can tell me to fuck off. But that guy, the guy who gives you languages, Artem, yeah, him, Artem, him, he hurts you." Saam paused, considering whether or not to tell his minder and friend to fuck off. He shrugged. He doesn't do it deliberately, and I can take a little pain. I'm not a... He was thinking about a story he had read to Lily. I'm not a princess. Johnson nodded, understanding the reference. He also had children, a princess, several mattresses, and a single pea, one of his daughter's favourites. He opened his mouth and shut it again. Then, "Okay, look, can I ask you a personal question? Would that be okay?" Saam looked amused. "If I can ask you one later." "Oh, okay, yes." He paused, then, "Okay, anything you like, but I need to understand something. I heard you say Artem can give English to Tash just by touching him. By holding his hand. That's very intimate for a Xonak. We would probably have to knock Tash out to do it. But it doesn't have to be full-on intercourse, does it? So why does he want to have sex with me?" Johnson looked at him. Saam lowered his lids a little and gazed at him through his lashes. "Are you serious?" He looked as though he might laugh. I see him all the time, Johnson thought. I forget he's beautiful. That's his fee for his services. Sex with... How to finish that sentence? With an expert. He gave a tiny wry smile at Johnson's facial expression. Johnson was trying not to wonder how his family would react to this conversation. His very Christian family. I think we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. "But you get hurt," Saam huffed. "Not deliberately. He gets overexcited." He made eye contact with Johnson, shrugged dismissively, as if the bruises, the pained walking, were nothing. Okay, I get it. Your attitude to sex is not the same as ours. I get that, but I've known you for a few years now. I've seen you collect, 100 phone numbers? From pretty women. Never from a man, not once. I've never heard you say a word against it, but I've never known you to do it for fun. And sometimes it makes you miserable. Not every time, but sometimes for days. So it's not as simple as that, is it?" Saam tilted his head a little, as if approving a slow pupil's sudden insight. Then he sighed, said quietly, "He's just big, really big, tall, heavy, twice my size, a lot stronger than me, like my owner when I was a boy." He was silent for a moment, giving Johnson time to imagine the child Saameron in a man's bed, and then desperately trying not to imagine it. Clumsy, doesn't know his own strength, doesn't hurt me deliberately, but yeah, he does hurt me. And if he didn't want to stop, I couldn't make him, not without killing him. Johnson knew he carried his knife everywhere. He was wearing it now. The material even passed through airport scanners. It would pass through a man's throat in a heartbeat. If he could get to it. If he was prepared to use it. He has a lot of stamina. It takes a lot to make him tired. It's exhausting. He slowed down. He wasn't looking at Johnson anymore. "Sometimes it makes me feel when I'm tired and I would rather just sleep. Like it's a marathon, some awful endurance task I just have to survive to finish. I have agreed to it, bartered for it, so it's not like I can just change my mind. Sometimes it reminds me what it feels like to have no choice. Sometimes it makes me feel like a thing, something you use for pleasure, not a man. And sometimes I remember what it feels like to be a slave." He yawned hugely, closed his eyes, said, "I haven't forgotten you owe me a personal question. A really personal one. Really, really personal. Hoo boy. I'm saving it for later." Then he slept. After landing, after Saam had finished throwing up, Johnson spoke again. "Okay, you're not a princess, but you are our most valuable asset when it comes to this stuff. There are an awful lot of languages on this planet. It seems to me we could hire people to translate for us. Didn't you say there was some genius guy at the police station who knew like 15 languages? A Japanese guy, I think he was." Saam nodded. "Yeah," he conceded. Johnson decided to leave it there. Let him think it through. Please, God, let him stop doing this to himself. The next time he saw Artem, Johnson just might have to do something about it. He just might have to take the big bastard down. And, he suspected, he just might get himself killed that way. Saam was picking up his phone messages. He looked troubled. They had been gone for 3 days. How much trouble could there be? What's happening? "It's a message from Nadia about Tash. They had a couple of good days with him, but something went wrong yesterday. She doesn't know what. He slept under his bed again last night, and now he won't come out. He doesn't answer when they speak to him. According to Lily, he's been crying." Johnson said, "I'll get the car."